Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're cutting straight through the usual daily political noise to do something a bit different. We are going to conduct an objective, step-by-step financial audit based on an incredibly dense, newly analyzed forensic report looking at Donald Trump's campaign finance and tax policy. By tracking the exact flow of dollars, literally from the initial donations right through to the final legislative outcomes, we can map out this fascinating ecosystem of political capital. So get ready, because we're following the money cycle from start to finish.
Okay, let's dive into this. $4.5 billion. I want you to just pause for a second and take in the staggering scale of that number. According to the Federal Election Commission and Open Secrets, this is the verified aggregate minimum of corporate and PAC inflows across the 2016, 2020, and 2024 through 2026 election cycles. We're talking about individual campaign committees, leadership PACs, and super PACs, the whole shebang. It is an absolutely massive war chest, and it serves as the foundational starting point for the economic cycle we're tracking today. Here is our clear roadmap to track the life cycle of this political capital. 1. The billion-dollar inflow. 2. The anatomy of tax shields. 3. Diverting public resources. And 4. The economic bottom line.
Let's start with part 1, the billion-dollar inflow.
So how exactly does a $4.5 billion war chest actually get built? Well, you definitely don't get to that number just through small dollar donations. You get there through highly concentrated institutional wealth. When we break down the primary corporate sectors funding this, the data is remarkably concentrated. It reveals that cash is heavily consolidated into 3 primary buckets. First, you have oil, gas, and fossil fuels. Second, Wall Street, real estate, and private equity. And third, casino, gaming, and ultra-wealthy megadonors. Now, these aren't just random industries, right? These are highly regulated sectors where federal tax and energy policies directly dictate their profit margins.
Now, what's really interesting about this is when you look at the specific institutional donors bankrolling these massive inflows. You have MAGA Inc. functioning as the primary super PAC dark money conduit, handling massive undisclosed aggregates. Then you've got individual mega donors like Timothy Mellon, the Pan Am Systems heir, injecting over $150 million, and Mariam Adelson of the Las Vegas Sands casino empire, contributing over $100 million through the Preserve America PAC. This is highly organized, high-volume capital deployment at work.
Which brings us to part 2, the anatomy of tax shields.
So how do these specific funding sectors, the fossil fuel giants, private equity firms, the mega donors, how do they actually benefit legislatively once their capital is deployed into the political system? Well, the forensic report points to one primary legislative vehicle, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA, of 2017. This act, combined with targeted administrative expansions under executive actions that have been maintained into 2026, really functioned as the key mechanism to create targeted tax shields for the exact industries we just looked at. Let's break down how this legislation structurally altered the tax landscape for these corporations. This is perhaps the most famous outcome of the legislation. The bill permanently slashed the top statutory corporate tax rate from 35% all the way down to 21%. By permanently removing that 14% delta, the legislation effectively erased hundreds of billions of dollars in future liabilities for major corporations. It's a huge shift. But, the broad corporate rate cut is really only half the story. The report also highlights incredibly specific targeted loopholes that were deliberately preserved. Enter the carried interest loophole. Let's quickly de-jargonize this complex financial concept. Despite a ton of public rhetoric promising to close it, the legislation actually preserved this specific shield. Essentially, it allows private equity and hedge fund managers to take what is standard service compensation, literally just the money they make for doing their everyday jobs, and mathematically mask it as long-term capital gains. And all they have to do is meet a relatively weak 3-year holding requirement.
And this brilliantly illustrates why that loophole matters so much to the Wall Street sector we identified earlier. If an executive pays the top ordinary income rate, their tax liability sits at 37%. But by utilizing the carried interest loophole, their tax liability gets capped at roughly 20%. That is a massive percentage of personal wealth shielded directly from the IRS, legally designed specifically for investment executives.
Moving right along to part 3, diverting public resources. $80 billion. We've seen the inflow of cash, and we've seen the tax shields created. Now we need to neutrally examine the direct outcomes of these legislative mechanics on our public resources. Because when tax revenue goes down, the balance sheet has to shift somewhere, right? The forensic report estimates the 10-year cumulative industry handout value at a staggering $80 billion.
This figure is the result of specific federal carbon capture subsidies, bonus depreciation extensions, and minimum tax exemptions. These were passed via legislative spending compromises and framework projections that span into 2025 and 2026. $80 billion is a monumental shift of capital.
So, where exactly does that $80 billion come from, and where does it end up? The report impartially contrasts this for us. The funds are effectively diverted from public programs like IRS tax enforcement budgets, public land renewable development allocations, and Department of Energy sustainable infrastructure grants. And they are diverted directly to multi-billion-dollar oil, gas, and petrochemical corporations. We're talking giants like Chevron, ExxonMobil, and large domestic drillers. Ultimately, it's a direct transfer of federal resources from public programs to specific private energy sectors.
Let's move to our final section and see how this builds into the economic bottom line.
Okay, we've tracked the money from the donor to the tax code to the corporate subsidy. Now, what does this actually mean for the broader economy? The resulting tax revenue gap creates a very real chain reaction. The report calculates a $40 billion minimum expansion of the federal deficit driven directly by those special fossil fuel royalty reductions and carbon infrastructure credits. But that federal deficit doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It directly translates into local funding deficits. It means stalled municipal green transition initiatives. It means a loss of federal grants designed for modernizing clean drinking water infrastructure. And it stalls long-term clean energy upgrades for our public schools. Basically, the legislative shields at the very top directly throttle local infrastructure down at the bottom.
So the crucial takeaway here is this. The political money cycle is an incredibly efficient investment vehicle. We have traced how a $4.5 billion campaign inflow from highly specific corporate sectors helped shape roughly $80 billion in targeted legislative outcomes and subsidies, which leaves us with one final, absolutely vital question to reflect on. When multi-billion-dollar financial cycles directly shape the tax code and divert public resources, who truly pays for the economic bottom line? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you next time as we continue to break down the complexities of our world.